All right, Alexander, we have a new Prime Minister for the UK, and it is Liz Truss. No surprise. She was expected to beat Sunak. She beat him by about 20,000 votes, give or take, something like that. And she's the new Prime Minister.
She's the new Prime Minister.
What else? What else could you say, really?
Well, one could say a few things. First of all, her margin of victory was actually rather smaller than some people had expected. I mean, it was expected that she would absolutely walk it. But clearly, and I suspect over the last few days, even amongst Conservative Party members, who I should say are an unusual group, they're rather old. Most of them are pensioners, and they have particular views. Let's put it like this: even amongst them, it seems the doubts were starting to grow about Liz Truss and about whether or not she was really the right person to become Prime Minister. And so there clearly has been some kind of a swing to Sunak. That's always assuming, of course, that you can rely on the opinion polls, which I think on this you can do. Opinion polls, the polls, I should say, of Conservative members. But the overall sense I'm getting in Britain is of a massive sense of fatalism bordering on despair from practically every part of the political spectrum, because Britain is facing enormous economic problems, enormous social problems. And I haven't seen one person who seriously believes that Liz Truss is going to be the person who could get on top of these problems. And of course, she's making comparisons between herself and Margaret Thatcher. And of course, that's always a dangerous thing to do, because Margaret Thatcher was a towering figure and Liz Truss is not. And of course, she gave her first big interview on British television just before she became Prime Minister. And I'm afraid she bombed. I think most people who watched it came away with the impression that, she didn't do very well. She came away as evasive. She doesn't seem to have much idea of what to do. She's coming up with old, dusted plans left over from the late Thatcher years, cutting taxes. She's even brought back one of Margaret Thatcher's old advisors, a man called Patrick Minford, an economist, but he must be pretty elderly by now. And overall, I just get the sense that unless she has hidden abilities of which no one can see, this has been an extremely bad choice, putting it mildly, and one which is going to continue to darken the general mood.
Right. There's a YouGov poll that came out, and let me pull it up here, which has by 50% to 22%, Britons are disappointed rather than pleased that Liz Truss is the new Prime Minister. That is the YouGov poll. Only 22% are satisfied of the voters of the Conservative Party. 41% are satisfied with her election. 34% are dissatisfied. Overall, 50% of Britons are dissatisfied with the election of Liz Truss to the post of Prime Minister. What do you make of?
Yeah, I think this is entirely representative. And when we're talking about 50% figures, that must include a lot of Conservatives. And if she'd come across as a sort of inspiring figure, it would be different. People would be looking to her. But I think that they look at her and they say that it's simply not, she doesn't come across as the kind of person who could really realistically take Britain forward. Even in the Daily Telegraph, which is a staunchly Conservative newspaper, to the point where one sometimes feels that it's almost part of the Conservative Party apparatus, they said that she's only got 6 weeks to prove that she can be a successful Prime Minister. Now, 6 weeks is, facing these kind of problems, it simply isn't going to happen. I can't see how it's going to happen. I would point out two other things. Firstly, I'd never even heard of Liz Truss until about 2 years ago. She's been in British cabinets for a long time, apparently, but she's never made much of impression. And secondly, her Chancellor is going to be Kwasi Kwarteng, whom I most emphatically have heard of, and whom I even slightly know. And I think one of the risks she runs is she's going to be overshadowed by her own Chancellor. But when you look at what she's proposing, she's not coming up with any real ideas people can believe in. It's just basically a collection of cliches and leftover ideas from the 1980s, reheated for very different circumstances. And I don't think anybody's convinced by them. I have to say this, I've said this before many times, I've never known things in Britain to be so bad. And I think with this new Prime Minister, they're going to get worse.
Right. In Cyprus and in Greece, they're actually saying that Liz Truss is far right. Do you believe that?
No.
I don't, but do you believe that?
No,
And
I don't believe that.
and who is okay? And who is? I'm trying to say. I want to say who is worse. In this, I'm trying to figure out how to phrase this. But compare Liz Truss to Boris Johnson. That's a more diplomatic way. Compare Liz Truss to Boris Johnson.
Liz Truss has been many different things at many times. At the time of the Brexit referendum, she voted and campaigned for Remain. I mean, she's now moved to a hardline Brexit position. She's done the same with everything. I mean, she's moved around her political positions as the mood shifts in the Conservative Party have happened. So she knows she can't become Prime Minister if she takes a Remain position, so she's taken a hardline Brexit position. She understands that in order to win over Conservative members, she's got to promise tax cuts, so she's promised tax cuts. That doesn't make her hard right. It just makes her basically opportunistic, and some would even say unprincipled. So, she's not
wannabe
hard right.
neoliberal.
Well, she is a neoliberal. I mean, but then
neoliberal.
Wannabe neoliberal. But bear in mind, if you're talking about the British political class, there are all of them neoliberal, neoconservative, globalist to some extent. I mean, in that she isn't different or distinctive. There isn't actually very much about Liz Truss that is different or distinctive. But if you want me to compare her with other prime ministers, well, she's probably not as good an administrator as Theresa May was, but she is probably as politically incompetent as Theresa May was. And she's probably, and she doesn't have anything like the kind of political flair that Boris Johnson, for all the fact that he was in many respects a disastrous Prime Minister, undoubtedly does have. I mean, again, there was a striking contrast between Liz Truss becoming Prime Minister and this disastrous interview she gave, and Boris Johnson's farewell speech, which was vintage Johnson. It was, sparkling. It was in places funny. It was weird. It was delusional, but it did show a genuine personality, a deeply flawed one, but somebody you could imagine as a kind of person. Liz Truss comes across as an apparatchik, not as dour as Theresa May, but little different in my opinion.
Can't you say that Boris Johnson was also kind of a flip-flopper? He kind of went anyway the wind took him. I mean, pro-Brexit, anti-Brexit. I mean, he was also just flip-flopping, back and forth until he found the formula to win.
Yes,
office,
that's exactly what he
was to be. Yeah, so I mean, Boris Johnson, though, at the end of the day, would it be fair to say that Boris Johnson, at the end of the day, for all his flaws, which I believe are tremendous, given what we know now as to how he manipulated the war in Ukraine, causing immeasurable suffering.
Yes.
He did have some smarts
Yes, he did.
Is it fair to say that Liz Truss does not have the smarts, and I'm being very diplomatic in the words that I choose, does not have the smarts to handle what is going to be an extremely challenging period?
Absolutely. I think you've summed it up perfectly. Liz Truss is Prime Minister by default. All the other people around her have been cancelled for one reason or another. Boris Johnson, who was the Prime Minister, I mean, he had panache, he had flair, he was deeply unprincipled, he was in many ways deeply immoral. He threw away the opportunities that he was given when he won the Brexit war, and he basically destroyed his own premiership. But he was a clever man, and as I said, he did have flair, but he destroyed himself, and we all know why. Sunak also destroyed himself for all kinds of other reasons. And the other people who stood in the leadership election, none of them were remotely convincing. So this Conservative Party membership ended up voting for Liz Truss because she was the least objectionable in the field. Now, that isn't a positive endorsement for her. It's not like what happened in the 1970s, for example, when Margaret Thatcher led an insurgency within the Conservative Party, won a political battle, gained control of the Conservative Party, led it in a completely different direction, and gained power that way. Having captured, if you like, the mood of the times. This isn't like that at all. Liz Truss has become Prime Minister by exhaustion. All other options are exhausted. So we are left with the lowest common denominator candidate, who is Liz Truss. And what you said about her lacking the smarts, I'm afraid is true.
What is the fascination that these conservative leaders have with gigantic figures of the past? Boris Johnson had this infatuation with Churchill, of which he does not measure up to the stature of Churchill. Whether you like Churchill or not, he's not of that stature. That's obvious. But he's completely fascinated by Churchill, and Liz Truss appears to be absolutely fascinated with Thatcher. And I think you just can't compare the two individuals. Thatcher, whether you like her or not, was a gigantic personality and historical leader, and Liz Truss is just, you just can't compare. But what is this fascination, this infatuation with these historical figures that this new crop of political elite in the UK seem to have?
Well, firstly, they have no ideas themselves, other than sort of globalist ones that they know are very unpopular, so they don't really want to talk about those. And, of course, they look into the past. They look to the past because that was when there was political success. So they hope to take elements of that success, bits of things that Thatcher and Churchill once did long ago, and they think that if it worked for Thatcher and Churchill in the 40s and 80s, then perhaps just possibly it might work for them. Your point is absolutely well made, by the way. One of the fundamental problems with Britain today is we are looking backwards. The Labour Party does the same, by the way. The Labour Party is always looking backwards at its previous leaders. Clement Attlee, in the case of the left, Harold Wilson, in the case of some people in the centre, Tony Blair on the part of some people on the right. But they always look, the British leadership, Labour or Conservative, looks backward. They don't look forward. And that also conveys a sense of a country whose good times, whose best times were in the past. A country that doesn't really have or feel that it has a promising future because its leaders live in the past. They look back to old splendours, old achievements, old leaders who they try to emulate but can't, because those leaders of former times, Churchill and Thatcher especially, lived in the present. They dealt with the problems of the present. They weren't looking to the past. They weren't looking obsessively at what other leaders before them had done. Churchill, of course, despite being a historian himself, he wrote a lot of history, and he wrote it well.
Right. Okay. The UK appears to be heading into third world status.
Yeah.
I mean, we don't have to go through all the stories, the memes, everything that's happening with inflation, the economy, energy, gas crisis, oil crisis, everything. It looks like the UK is heading towards third world status. Liz Truss doesn't appear to be someone who's ready to take the simplest of moves to alleviate some of the pressure. It's not going to solve everything, but to alleviate some of the pressure, which is to roll back sanctions against Russia. She won't do it. As a matter of fact, she said that she pretty much said the first person she's going to call is Zelensky. So, I mean, there you have it. So we're not going to see any change there. So, you know, the bus continues to move over the cliff, and it'll definitely crash over the cliff. I think Liz Truss is exactly the wrong person at the wrong time.
Yeah.
No doubt about that. Nicola Sturgeon said that Liz Truss will be a disaster if she governs as she campaigns, and there's a lot of issues there with another referendum and some of the rhetoric that Liz Truss has said about that. Look to the future. These people look towards the past, but look to the future. Where are things heading now that we know that Liz Truss will be the captain of this Titanic?
Well, indeed. I mean, the only way forward is for something to come up from the grassroots. And I mean, it happened with Brexit, so it's not impossible. There is a chance that there will be some kind of mobilisation in the grassroots. Farage is back. I mean, he gave a big interview in which he said that the Conservative Party has completely betrayed its supporters, and essentially he was basically hinting it needs to be destroyed. I know plenty of people on the left who feel that about the Labour Party, even though because of the shambles in the country and the Labour and the collapse of the government. Because be very clear about this, Liz Truss's election is a symptom of governmental collapse. I mean, the Conservative government is now basically sinking. It's likely we're going to have a Labour government led by Keir Starmer very soon, not because there's any great enthusiasm or belief in Keir Starmer, but simply because he's the alternative at the moment. But it's again an alternative in which no one believes and which doesn't really offer any solutions. So at some point, if there's going to be any change, it has to come from people who are generally on the right and generally on the left, and they got to break with this political consensus. Now, it's happened in the past in Britain, but the problem is the political class has closed the ring of control so tightly this time that it is going to be far more difficult. In the late 19th century, in the early 20th century, it was possible for the Labour Party, for example, to emerge and break the old Liberal Party and break the old Tory Liberal consensus. That'd be much more difficult to do today. I mean, bear in mind that the old Labour Party had its enormous grassroots support across the country, the unions, the various, civil society organisations that already existed in those days. There's nothing comparable to that in Britain today. And if you go back a little further still, the Conservative Party also, as we have come to know it, emerged out of a revolt by what was then the right against the liberal consensus that existed in Britain in the 1840s. But again, it too had powerful grassroots institutions that it could grow, that it could build on. We don't have anything like that in Britain today. They've all been captured. the political class basically controls them all. So it's going to be extremely difficult. And I have to say, I've never been so concerned about my country, and I do feel it to be my country. As you rightly say, it does feel like we're the Titanic heading full steam ahead for the iceberg, and the captain isn't up to the job, and nor does any other captain appear to be. And yes, you'll find lots of people in Britain who are dissatisfied, lots of people with ideas, lots of people with proposals about how to take things forward. But it's very, very difficult for them to break through.
Okay, we will leave it there, the Duran.locals.com, and go to the Duran shop, 10% off, use the code GOOD DAY. Take care.